Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a big one. What does it truly mean to be human? We're using Joseph LeDoux's book, The Four Realms of Existence, as our roadmap. You, our listener, shared excerpts covering, well, pretty much everything from the fundamental building blocks of life to the mysteries of consciousness and even how we tell stories to ourselves.
It's quite a sweep.
It really is. So our mission is to distill LeDoux's key ideas into a clear and hopefully engaging conversation, offering you a fresh perspective beyond, the usual notions of self and personality.
Right.
Prepare for some potentially mind-bending concepts, like the idea that you might be more of a process than a fixed thing, and how different parts of your brain contribute to your experience of being.
LeDoux's work it's a fascinating attempt to ground our understanding of ourselves in something more concrete, more biological. What's crucial here, I think, is his framework of these interconnected realms: biological, neurobiological, cognitive, and conscious. He's really trying to move away from purely abstract ideas about what it means to be human.
Okay, let's jump right into the biological realm then, the foundation of it all.
The starting point.
For ages, we've debated the body and mind as separate entities. Now, science tells us our mental life is deeply connected to our physical brain. But, even knowing that, it's still hard to shake the feeling that our thoughts and feelings are somehow different from, say, our blood flow or digestion, isn't it?
That's the central puzzle, absolutely. And LeDoux points out that while science has made huge leaps in fields like physics, AI, genetics, it's also kind of left us with a gap, almost an epistemological vacuum, he calls it, in our overall understanding of human nature.
Yeah.
We've dismantled a lot of the old explanations, but haven't quite put together a complete new picture.
Exactly. It's like we have all these puzzle pieces, but the picture on the box is missing. And it's not like thinkers haven't tried to define us over the centuries. Philosophy gave way to psychology, but then behaviorism tried to, ignore the inner world altogether and just focus on what we do.
The behaviorist approach, yeah.
Yeah.
While it aimed for scientific rigor, it ultimately felt too limiting for many because it just disregarded the richness of our internal experience.
Right.
What's significant is the subsequent need for new ways of thinking. LeDoux argues that our ingrained, centuries-old ideas about self and personality might actually be holding us back.
Holding us back from what the science is showing us.
Exactly, from truly understanding what the science is revealing.
So instead of sticking to these old definitions, LeDoux takes us back a bit, even mentioning Aristotle and his ideas about different ways of being vegetative, just staying alive.
Like plants.
Animative, moving around, and rational thinking. From there, LeDoux introduces this concept of an ensemble of being. What's that about?
Okay, so if we zoom out and look at the bigger picture, this ensemble of being is like a snapshot in time. It's a description of all the different activities happening across those four realms at any given moment.
So not a thing in itself.
Exactly. It's not a separate entity, not a thing we possess. This is a key shift, he's suggesting, that maybe the fixed self or personality we often talk about isn't really a stable object.
That's a really interesting way to put it, a constantly changing state rather than a permanent fixture. Now, when we think about what even defines life, Aristotle thought the soul gave life, and Galen talked about pneuma, a vital breath.
These historical views really illustrate humanity's long-standing quest to understand the fundamental difference between something being alive and not. Which brings us to the vitalism movement.
Right.
The belief in a non-physical life force.
Oh yeah, the idea that there was some special ingredient, a vital spark that living things had and inanimate objects didn't. I think even someone like Pasteur, with all his scientific breakthroughs, held on to parts of this idea for a while.
He did, for a time. But what's fascinating is how scientific discoveries gradually undermined vitalism. The synthesis of urea, for example, an organic compound from inorganic materials.
That was a big one.
A huge one. It showed that the building blocks of life weren't necessarily governed by some mysterious force separate from chemistry. It really reshaped our understanding.
And that leads us to Claude Bernard and his concept of the internal milieu, right? That stable environment inside our bodies, and homeostasis, keeping everything balanced.
Yes, Bernard's focus on maintaining this internal stability was revolutionary. Homeostasis is indeed critical. And a more modern extension of this is allostasis.
Allostasis.
It's the body's ability to anticipate future needs and proactively adjust to maintain balance rather than just reacting.
Okay. Predicting and preparing.
Exactly. And at the cellular level, metabolic homeostasis powered by mitochondria is just essential for providing the energy we need to do anything.
Right. It's not just reacting, it's preparing. Now, shifting to our genetic makeup, LeDoux points out something interesting. Each of us has a unique genome, yet at the same time, there's a fundamental similarity across all our cells.
These are kind of the twin pillars of our biological individuality. Our unique genetic code contributes to the vast differences we see between people,
Makes us unique.
while the shared genetic instructions across our cells enable them to work together in incredibly complex ways to form an organism. Of course, when things go wrong with this cellular cooperation, that's often when illness can arise.
And it's not just about individual genes or cells. LeDoux mentions Novikov's idea of integrative levels of organization, this increasing complexity where things that were once whole become parts of something larger.
Right. Novikov's framework helps us see how life has evolved through layers of integration. Think of it like this. Genes work together in networks. Networks form cells, cells form tissues, and so on. Each level shows new properties that weren't present at the level below.
Okay.
Mikad's work on major evolutionary transitions, like the jump from single-celled to multicellular life, really illustrates this kind of hierarchical organization.
It's like a biological tower, each level building on the previous one. But then LeDoux asks us to rethink what we even mean by a biological individual, bringing in ideas from people like Hall, Godfrey Smith, and Perdue.
Yeah, this is where our traditional ideas get challenged a bit. Hall argued that natural selection doesn't just act on individual organisms, but on a whole hierarchy of biological entities.
Not just the whole animal or plant.
No. Godfrey Smith focuses on Darwinian populations and Darwinian individuals defined by their heritable traits and reproductive success, which might not always align perfectly with our usual idea of a single organism. Perdue, while acknowledging this broader view, still maintains that the organism represents the most integrated and cohesive form of biological individuality, even when you consider, say, the bacteria in our gut or a developing fetus inside a mother.
So it's a more nuanced understanding, recognizing the interconnectedness, but still seeing the organism as pretty central. And finally, in the biological realm, we have that massive leap from single-celled to multicellular life.
That transition was just pivotal in the history of life. It required cells to develop really intricate ways of communicating and cooperating, moving beyond simple clusters to form truly multicellular organisms, usually originating from a single fertilized egg.
Right.
This led to the specialization of cells, skin cells doing different jobs than brain cells, and the crucial role of chemical messengers like hormones in coordinating the activities of the entire organism.
All right, so that lays the biological groundwork. Really fascinating stuff. Now let's delve into the neurobiological realm, the evolution of nervous systems. LeDoux says they emerged as a way for living things to coordinate their actions and control their behavior more effectively.
Exactly. The development of action potentials, those rapid electrical signals in nerve cells, was a major innovation. But interestingly, this wasn't entirely new. Single-celled organisms already had similar mechanisms involving cilia, those little hair-like structures.
It's like evolution found a good trick and repurposed it. Huh?
Sort of, yeah. And these early creatures, like protozoa, had basic stimulus response behaviors. Then we see those cilia evolving into muscles and neurons. That transformation was fundamental for developing more complex behaviors. In early animals like jellyfish, we see a simple nervous system called a nerve net.
A nerve net.
This network controls both basic behaviors like moving towards food or away from danger, and also essential functions like maintaining metabolic balance.
So even at the very beginning, the nervous system is handling both our actions and our internal state.
Yes, both sides. Then we see these systems becoming more sophisticated, moving from those diffuse nerve nets to more centralized systems with paired nerve cords in creatures like flatworms and eventually vertebrates.
Centralization seems key.
It allowed for much more precise control of movement and a greater ability to process sensory information. One key evolutionary development highlighted by LeDoux was the change in therapsids.
Really reptile.
An early group of reptiles, yeah. Their legs position themselves directly under their bodies.
Oh yeah, that seemingly small change allowed them to breathe and run at the same time, had a huge advantage. And this eventually led to warm-bloodedness and better eyesight, didn't it?
Precisely. The increased energy demands supported endothermy, warm-bloodedness, and the need to be more active likely drove improvements in their visual systems. Then, after a major extinction event,
Wiped out the big guys.
right, the smaller therapsids, specifically the cynodonts, survived by adapting to nocturnal life, which ultimately paved the way for the evolution of mammals.
So the demise of the dinosaurs actually created an opportunity for mammals to thrive. And these early mammals were small, nocturnal creatures.
Benefiting from the absence of large, active during-the-day predators, early mammals could explore different ecological niches and eventually increase in size. Now, thinking about the brain itself, LeDoux discusses the basic components of the mammalian forebrain and how they can be traced back to earlier vertebrates.
We're talking about the telencephalon, which includes the cerebral hemispheres and cortex, and the diencephalon, with structures like the thalamus and hypothalamus. And the cerebral cortex itself has that layered structure, right?
Yes, the layering or lamination of the cerebral cortex is a defining characteristic. We have the allocortex, the oldest part, then the mesocortex, and finally the neocortex, which is the most recent and has expanded dramatically in primates, including us.
That's the wrinkly bit we usually think of.
That's the one. However, it's important to note that the older idea of the triune brain, MacLean's idea,
The lizard brain, mammal brain, human brain idea.
exactly, with neatly separated layers, each responsible for specific functions, that's been largely revised. Brain functions are really distributed across complex networks rather than being strictly confined to single areas.
Right, it's more like interconnected circuits than isolated compartments.
Yeah.
And LeDoux emphasizes this fundamental and continuous distinction between the somatic dealing with the body's external environment and visceral dealing with internal organs, parts of the nervous system.
This distinction is incredibly ancient, even predating the development of a centralized nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, the ANS.
Fight or flight, rest and digest.
That's part of it, yeah. It controls our internal organs. And while it was initially viewed as purely a motor system sending signals out, we now know it's a complex two-way street. It's constantly receiving sensory information from the body and adjusting its activity through the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. These non-conscious visceral states constantly contribute to maintaining our body's internal balance, our homeostasis.
And then we have those crucial brainstem circuits involved in keeping us awake and alert, the reticular formation and the release of important chemicals like norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine.
Absolutely. These brainstem regions, along with the more recently understood role of orexin, are vital for regulating our overall level of arousal and influencing a wide range of bodily functions. But our nervous system isn't just hardwired from birth. Sensory experience after we're born plays a critical role in shaping our sensory abilities.
Oh, definitely. The classic studies where they temporarily sewed kittens' eyes shut,
Hubel and Weissel.
right, showed how crucial early visual experience is for normal sight development. And we see this across all our senses, the fine-tuning of our sense of smell, how birds learn their songs, even how we perceive subtle differences in sounds, like the R and L sounds for Japanese speakers, can be influenced by what we experience early in life.
What's really interesting is how our sensory systems learn through prediction. When what we expect to happen doesn't, a prediction error signal drives learning.
Learning from mistakes, basically.
In a way, yes. We also learn through Pavlovian associations, where we link neutral stimuli with important biological or psychological events. Think Pavlov's dogs. Even basic reflexes, like withdrawing your hand from something hot, can be conditioned through Pavlovian learning, and the cerebellum plays a key role in this type of motor learning.
And then there's the amygdala-centered defensive survival circuit, which LeDoux has studied extensively. He actually prefers this term over the more common fear center, right?
Exactly. Because this circuit is designed to detect and respond to threats, it doesn't simply produce the conscious feeling of fear. That feeling comes later, potentially. That's why he uses the term Pavlovian threat conditioning.
Okay.
Then we have instrumental habit conditioning, where we learn through trial and error, associating specific actions with rewards or punishments, like Thorndike's famous experiments with cats in puzzle boxes.
Learning by doing, essentially, getting the reward stamps in the behavior.
Right. And while the hippocampus was initially primarily linked to emotion, maybe through its connections with the amygdala, we now understand its vital role in creating spatial maps of our environment, forming memories, and even in learning stimulus response associations, especially in the context of finding food or foraging.
So it helps us navigate and remember where things are.
The hippocampus, connected to the sensory parts of our neocortex and a brain region called the dorsal lateral striatum, is crucial for navigating our world and remembering important locations. Habits themselves, while they can feel automatic, are actually sequences of learned actions, action chunks really, that reflect our past trial and error learning.
All right, so from the neurobiological mechanisms, we now move up to the cognitive realm. And LeDoux defines cognition as our ability to use internal representations, essentially, mental models of the world, to control our behavior in flexible ways.
This ability to internally represent information and use it to guide our actions marks a significant step. The scientific study of cognition really took off in a way, with Darwin's idea that there's a continuity of mental abilities between animals and humans.
Ah, so not a sharp divide.
Right. Which led to comparative psychology and its focus on understanding intelligent behavior across species.
And these early comparative psychologists were keen to understand the evolutionary roots of our mental lives, often using Thorndike's instrumental learning experiments, the puzzle boxes and mazes.
They viewed reinforcement as a process that selects for certain behaviors, much like natural selection favors certain biological traits. Interestingly, Thorndike himself later revised his thinking a bit, suggesting that habits become stamped in without necessarily needing an intentional mental agent guiding the process.
More automatic.
Yeah.
Then came Watson and the behaviorist movement, arguing that all behavior could be explained as chains of simple Pavlovian reflexes. But ultimately, Thorndike's instrumental learning approach became more influential, didn't it?
It did. The focus shifted away from trying to understand internal mental states towards studying observable connections between stimuli and responses. However, within psychology, the concept of schema emerged.
Schema.
Yeah, as a way to conceptualize these internal frameworks linked bundles of memories and knowledge that we use to understand and respond to the world. They shape how we perceive, think, feel, and remember.
So these mental frameworks help us make sense of new information and guide our actions. Now, Tolman challenged the strict behaviorist view, proposing that animal behavior was actually goal-directed or purposive. He even brought in ideas from Gestalt psychology about how we perceive the world as organized wholes.
Tolman argued for the importance of internal cognitive factors, things like thoughts and expectations in driving behavior. His famous work on latent learning in rats.
The maze experiments.
Yeah, exactly, where rats explored a maze without any reward and then later used that knowledge to find food quickly once a reward was introduced. That demonstrated the existence of these internal cognitive maps.
Right, the rats were forming a mental layout of the maze, even without immediate reinforcement. They weren't just learning simple SR links.
No, and Tolman described stimuli being processed into a tentative, cognitive-like map that then guided their responses. It wasn't just automatic.
Okay.
Around the same time, Hebb's highly influential book, The Organization of Behavior, really broke with behaviorism by emphasizing the crucial role of internal brain states in psychological processes.
The idea of cell assemblies and phase sequences.
Precisely. And Brenda Milner's studies on the amnesic patient HM, who is actually one of Hebb's students.
A landmark case.
Absolutely pivotal. It provided groundbreaking evidence for the hippocampus's role in forming and storing long-term memories, and crucially, the distinction between conscious, explicit memory and unconscious, implicit or procedural learning.
That research was huge, showing we have different kinds of memory, some we can consciously access and others that operate more behind the scenes. And then there was the famous debate over language acquisition. Skinner versus Chomsky.
Oh, yeah. Skinner taking a behaviorist stance based on reinforcement, and Chomsky arguing for an innate internal generative grammar.
Language acquisition device.
Right. This debate really highlighted the limitations of trying to explain complex human abilities like language solely through simple learning principles. Also during this period, Miller's work on the magic number 7 plus or minus 2.
Short-term memory limits.
Revealed the limited capacity of our short-term memory, but also the clever cognitive strategy of chunking information to overcome this limitation.
Showing that while our immediate mental workspace has limits, we have ways to make the most of it. Now, LeDoux points out that cognition and consciousness are deeply intertwined.
They are indeed. You can't really talk about one without the other eventually coming up. While Descartes famously believed all mental activity was conscious, later thinkers recognized the possibility of unconscious thoughts. Early psychology actually focused heavily on consciousness.
Wundt, James.
Exactly. But then behaviorism actively tried to eliminate it from scientific study. Cognitive psychology then emerged by focusing on how we process information, taking a more cautious approach to understanding both conscious and unconscious processes, importantly, distinct from earlier Freudian ideas about the unconscious.
These early cognitive scientists were interested in the flow of information in the mind, how we take in, process, and store information, often drawing inspiration from how computers work, information processing models.
Right. And this leads us to the important concept of working memory.
The mind's scratch pad.
Kind of, yeah. It's the brain system that allows us to temporarily hold and manipulate information while we're performing complex cognitive tasks like understanding language, Reasoning, problem solving.
Crucial for thinking.
Absolutely. Baddeley's influential model proposed that working memory has a central executive that controls attention.
The boss.
Sort of. And two specialized systems, the articulatory loop for verbal information and the visuospatial sketchpad for visual and spatial information. Later models added more components like the episodic buffer.
The central executive as the director, and then these more specialized subsystems. We also have semantic memories, our general knowledge about facts and concepts, like knowing Paris is the capital of France.
Exactly. Semantic memories are essential for understanding and categorizing the world, forming the foundation for our language use and our ability to grasp abstract concepts in fields like science, art, politics, you name it. And then we have mental models.
Yeah, yes, mental models, like
Yeah.
internal simulations.
That's a good way to think about it. We use them to think about possible future events and predict outcomes without actually having to experience them, playing out scenarios in our minds.
And LeDoux emphasizes that much of this mental model processing happens outside of our conscious awareness.
Yes, a lot of the construction and manipulation can be non-conscious. Johnson Laird's work on mental models and reasoning showed how we construct these internal representations to draw inferences, but he also highlighted that these models are limited by the capacity of our working memory.
So they can be faulty.
They can sometimes lead to errors in our thinking. This brings us back to the distinction between model-based or goal-directed behavior and model-free or habitual behavior.
Goal-directed actions involve actively using working memory and considering the value of our goals, whereas habits are more automatic, stimulus response-driven.
Right. And it seems that our ability to engage in model-based decision-making is linked to how well our working memory functions. It can also be negatively affected by stress.
Stress makes us fall back on habits.
It tends to, yeah. And impairments in working memory can hinder our ability to think through consequences and make goal-directed choices. This is observed in conditions like schizophrenia and also relates to the more impulsive behavior often seen in children and adolescents whose prefrontal cortex and working memory capacity are still developing.
Makes sense.
While the model-based, model-free distinction is a useful way to broadly characterize cognitive and non-cognitive processes, we have to remember that the analogy to computers, while helpful initially, has its limitations.
Absolutely. The human mind is far more complex and, well, messy than any computer. Now, when we consider the evolution of this model-based cognition, we see evidence of spatial mapping abilities, even in non-mammalian vertebrates like birds or reptiles.
True, but as Bennett has pointed out, simply having a mental map of your environment doesn't necessarily equate to full-blown model-based cognition. It arguably requires the ability to mentally simulate movement within that map and anticipate the consequences of different actions.
So true simulation is key.
That seems to be the crucial step. Mammals and birds generally perform well on cognitive tests designed to assess goal-directed behavior, while lower vertebrates often struggle. Though we should be mindful that these tests might be biased towards mammalian ways of thinking.
Good point. So true cognition involves those internal mental processes, that simulation, not just complex-looking behavior. And this cognitive capacity continued to evolve in mammals, then primates, apes, and ultimately humans, driven by different pressures.
Foraging for food was likely a huge selective pressure driving the evolution of these cognitive abilities in mammals. Early mammals probably relied heavily on their sense of smell and more automatic, model-free behaviors when in unfamiliar territories.
Playing it safe.
But they could use mental models of familiar areas to assess the potential rewards of different foraging strategies. Then you have early primates evolving as manual foragers in trees, developing better hand-eye coordination and grasping abilities, binocular vision.
For grabbing insects and fruit.
Exactly. Monkeys, later, as visual foragers adapting to changing environments, benefited from improved vision for finding food across larger areas during the day, often on the ground.
And then we have the cognitive leaps seen in apes. What was different there?
Apes seem to have added more sophisticated conceptual abilities and stronger top-down executive control to their mental toolkit.
Executive control.
Things like planning, inhibiting impulses, flexible thinking. Apes developed the capacity for inferential reasoning and a more general form of intelligence, even demonstrating the ability to delay gratification in some studies, like with chimpanzees.
Waiting for a bigger reward.
Right. And humans, LeDoux characterizes us as the ultimate cognitive foragers, with a unique capacity to balance exploring new possibilities with exploiting known resources, often juggling multiple goals simultaneously based on internal plans and desires.
And when we look at the brains of early vertebrates, we can actually see the precursors to the mammalian forebrain structures that are now involved in all these complex cognitive functions.
Absolutely. These early brain regions were involved in basic sensory processing, motor control, navigation, encoding the value of things, forming habits, and coordinating visceral functions. Going back to model-free versus model-based foraging, the hippocampus, with its place and grid cells that represent our location.
The brain's GPS.
Kind of, yeah. It's crucial for creating those spatial maps. But model-based foraging requires us to be able to use those maps in our mental simulations to plan routes and anticipate outcomes.
And the cellular basis for this high-level control, the executive function, seems to lie in the lateral granular prefrontal cortex, the PFC, working together with the parietal cortex in a network that directs our attention.
Yes, the granular prefrontal cortex, particularly the lateral part, is key for exerting that top-down control over what information we hold and manipulate in working memory. Another important area is the frontal pole, the very front of the PFC.
What does that do?
It can be thought of as a kind of superconnector, receiving input from various other brain regions, including lateral PFC, and projecting back. It plays a critical role in things like multitasking, considering different options, and abstract thought. The fact that rodents lack this specific granular prefrontal cortex might explain some of the differences in complex cognition between them and primates.
Interesting structural difference.
Yeah.
And the remarkable power of human working memory seems to be due in part to language, which allows us to represent things symbolically, and also our expanded granular prefrontal cortex. It provides that essential temporary storage space for integrating information from different specialized brain areas, right? Like vision and hearing.
Exactly. And ultimately, the focus of research is shifting a bit. From looking for unique macroscopic brain regions that only humans have, to examining gene expression at a microscopic level and how subtle differences in gene activity influence the organization and function of the neocortex. These subtle differences likely contribute to the significant cognitive differences we see between humans and other primates.
So it's more about how the parts are wired and regulated.
Largely, yes. Our specialized brains, combined with the fundamental goal-directed circuits we share with other primates, give us unparalleled working memory capacity for mentally exploring possibilities and constructing future scenarios. Though it's important to remember LeDoux's point that special, in this context, simply means different, not necessarily inherently better.
Good clarification.
Okay.
We've explored the biological and neurobiological foundations and the rise of cognition. Now we arrive at the fascinating and often perplexing realm of consciousness, the fourth realm.
The big one.
And right away, LeDoux tackles the philosophical, hard problem. Why and how do our physical brain processes give rise to subjective inner experience? Why does it feel like something to be us? He suggests this might be more of a philosophical than a strictly scientific question.
LeDoux aligns with thinkers who emphasize what's been called the real problem of consciousness, which is
What's the real problem then?
to actually explain, predict, and understand the phenomenal properties of our conscious experience, accepting it as an inherent part of our physical reality, rather than getting stuck on the why it exists at all in a physical world. He points out the limitations of pure logic in resolving the age-old mind-body problem, echoing the view that a non-physical consciousness is, well, a problematic concept for scientists because it's difficult to formulate testable hypotheses about it.
So a focus on ideas we can actually investigate empirically, and a healthy dose of skepticism towards claims that can't be tested, like maybe panpsychism in inactive logic gates, which he mentions as an example of something untestable.
Right. He leans towards prioritizing empirically productive hypotheses. He contrasts the idea of patiently waiting for non-materialist views to just erode as empirical theories get better, with his own view, which is, perhaps more simply, accepting that science deals with the physical world.
And he even touches on the historical attempt to unify all of science under the principles of physics, Carnap's idea.
Carnap's Unity of Science program aimed to reduce all scientific disciplines to the language and laws of physics. This is relevant because it connects to the behaviorist movement's attempt to banish consciousness from psychology entirely, famously calling it the ghost in the machine, as Ryle put it.
That push to make psychology a purely objective science, focusing only on what you can directly observe and measure. And while Dennett has famously argued that the cognitive movement largely overcame the behaviorism.
Right, the cognitive revolution.
LeDoux notes that behaviorist ways of thinking, that reluctance to talk about internal states, still have some lingering influence, even today.
And with the rise of neuroscience, psychology faced and still faces pressure to be fully reducible to neural activity. with some suggesting that neuroscience would eventually replace psychological explanations entirely. Think of the Churchlands or Crick or Dawkins expressing similar views.
Eliminative materialism, basically.
In some forms, yes. Now, LeDoux agrees with this reductionist view partially. He thinks it works well for more automatic, model-free neurobiological processes like reflexes and habits. But he strongly cautions against casually using mental state language, like fear, to describe brain states that control behavior non-consciously.
Right. Back to the amygdala example, calling it a fear center is misleading. It's more accurately described functionally as a defensive survival circuit.
Hmm.
Fear itself is the conscious feeling we have when we become aware we're in danger.
Exactly. And for more complex conscious experiences, it's not just sensory input that matters. Memory, language processing, all sorts of other information coming into the prefrontal cortex are absolutely crucial. Memory, he says, acts as the ultimate curator of our conscious experience.
The ultimate curator. I like that.
LeDoux then proposes a more nuanced, multi-level model of consciousness. It goes beyond the simple idea of information just flowing from sensory areas up to the prefrontal cortex for awareness to happen.
So not just a simple relay.
No. His model suggests a hierarchy of brain structures creating different types of mental states, which are then further processed and essentially redescribed or re-represented by prefrontal cortex circuits. This re-representation contributes to our higher-order thinking and our subjective conscious experience.
So a more intricate and layered process than a simple one-way street. And this model, with multiple levels of representation, suggests that there are numerous and somewhat redundant representations in the prefrontal cortex, which might explain why damage to one specific part of the PFC doesn't always completely eliminate awareness, right?
Exactly. The redundancy provides resilience. Different regions within the prefrontal cortex seem to contribute in specific ways to our conscious experiences. We touched on this briefly, but the lateral PFC enables flexible top-down control, focusing attention.
Keeping us on task.
The ventrolateral PFC is involved in processing more basic abstract concepts, while the dorsolateral PFC handles higher-level abstract reasoning. The medial PFC integrates information about our internal bodily state, contributing to our sense of self and our emotional experiences. And the orbitofrontal PFC connects external sensory information with our internal bodily states and learned values crucial for decision-making and social behavior.
A real division of labor up there. And the mesocortex, that kind of transitional area between the older allocortex and the newer neocortex, seems to play a particularly significant role in human consciousness. Why is that?
LeDoux suggests its connections with the PFC and memory systems might allow us to create richer, more complex mental models of both our inner and outer worlds compared to other mammals. It's deeply involved in integrating emotion and cognition.
Interesting. And he speculates that if the entire prefrontal cortex were somehow absent, we might see other, more primitive forms of consciousness emerge, possibly relying on areas like the parietal cortex or even the hippocampus.
It's speculative, of course, but it raises interesting questions about the different layers of awareness. This connects nicely to Tulving's distinction between semantic memory, our knowledge of facts, and episodic memory, our memory of personal experiences.
Right. Tulving linked these to different types of consciousness. Noetic and autonoetic.
Exactly. Noetic consciousness is based on knowing facts and concepts, often relying on those schemas we talked about earlier. It's knowing that something is the case.
Knowing Paris is the capital.
Yes. While autonoetic consciousness is that feeling of remembering a specific event from your past and placing yourself within that memory, it's linked to our personal history and our ability to mentally travel back in time and also project ourselves into the future.
That feeling of, I was there.
Precisely. And LeDoux emphasizes that the self in this autonoetic consciousness is primarily informational. It's a kind of ongoing narrative we construct based on our episodic memories rather than being a separate agent or entity that actively controls our behavior from moment to moment.
So the self is a story we tell ourselves based on memories.
In this view, largely yes. And he suggests that a kind of unspoken, tacit, personal knowledge accompanies all our conscious experiences. Studying consciousness, then, can involve looking at these more fundamental states of semantic and episodic memory because they provide the content for noetic and autonoetic awareness.
And explicit memories are simply those memories that we can consciously access and bring to mind, leading to either that sense of knowing, noetic, or that sense of remembering, autonoetic. But Tulving also proposed a third type of conscious experience, Anoesis? What was that again?
Anoesis, Tolkien called it non-knowing consciousness. It's associated more with procedural memory, our knowledge of how to do things, like riding a bike or typing skills that often operate implicitly.
Okay.
It's also related to what's sometimes called fringe consciousness, those vague feelings, intuitions, or senses of familiarity or rightness that often accompany our explicit thoughts. And Oasis gives our noetic and autonoetic experiences there, as LeDoux puts it, warmth, tenderness, and intimacy.
The feeling tone.
The feeling tone, exactly. Metcalf and Son have suggested that anoesis might involve the re-representation by higher brain areas of our own implicit knowledge about how well we know something or how fluent our processing is. It acts as a kind of bridge between unconscious processing and explicit conscious awareness.
So that background feeling that accompanies our conscious thoughts, like a sense of rightness or perhaps unease or familiarity, and for us to be consciously aware of feelings like danger, LeDoux argues that the mesocortical prefrontal cortex needs to re-represent those more basic states generated elsewhere, like the activity in the amygdala's defensive circuit.
Right. That re-representation is key for the feeling to become conscious. Phenomenological philosophers like Husserl and Sartre have long argued that these pre-reflective states are necessary for our more developed reflective self-awareness. Anoesis can be seen as a kind of pre-reflective experience in this framework.
And interestingly, he mentions that practices like meditation and mindfulness, or even potentially psychedelics, might help us to decouple these anoetic feelings from our more explicit thoughts and beliefs, perhaps reducing our strong identification with them.
It's an intriguing possibility. LeDoux suggests that anoesis is a primitive form of mental state consciousness that subtly colors our explicit awareness with a non-conceptual feeling, sitting somewhere between fully unconscious processing and explicit conscious thought.
And he brings in the concept of deep learning, like in AI, as a possible mechanism for how these unconscious procedural circuits provide the context for those anoetic feelings, suggesting our brain might operate like a deep learning computer, constantly making predictions and learning from errors.
Yeah, he explores that analogy. Deep learning models are very good at reducing uncertainty by using past learning to make predictions about the future. When we think about simple sensory experiences, like seeing the color red, higher order theories of consciousness emphasize that for us to consciously perceive red, there needs to be a re-representation of that initial sensory information, possibly involving this procedural metacognitive process that underlies anoesis.
So it's not just the sensory input, it's the brain processing its own processing of that input.
That's the core idea of higher order theories, yes. Anoesis typically doesn't require much working memory. It's often just a background hum. However, if our deeply ingrained predictions at this anoetic level are violated, like seeing a purple apple when we strongly expect red, it can create a sense of dissonance or surprise, and that pushes us towards more explicit, effortful cognitive processing to figure out what's going on.
It sounds like our emotional experiences involve a wider range of these underlying procedural states being re-represented compared to simple sensory perceptions, which makes sense. Emotions feel more complex.
They generally do. And he notes that when we expect a certain bodily response to accompany an emotion based on our past experiences or cultural learning, but we don't actually get that strong physical signal, we might mentally fill in the blanks, a kind of cognitive fiat to make the feeling make sense or feel right.
Our brains strive for coherence.
Constantly. LeDoux resists the temptation, though, to equate these anoetic states directly with the philosophical concept of qualia, the raw subjective feel of experience, mostly because of the non-physical baggage that often comes with the term qualia.
Sticking to the physical?
He also points out the significant challenges in scientifically studying consciousness in animals. We often rely heavily on our own intuitions and projecting our experiences onto them.
So just because an animal reacts to a stimulus in a way that looks like fear to us, doesn't necessarily mean it's having the same conscious experience of fear that we do. There could be simpler non-conscious explanations.
Exactly. Leaner explanations should often be preferred. And the term sentience, which is often used, sometimes just means the basic ability to respond to stimuli. LeDoux suggests this might just indicate a basic level of being alive, what he calls creature consciousness, rather than guaranteeing the presence of subjective feeling or phenomenal consciousness.
So problem-solving abilities alone aren't proof of feeling.
Not necessarily proof of phenomenal feeling, no. LeDoux proposes that anoesis, as a basic form of mental state consciousness arising from that mesocortical re-representation, might actually explain the fundamental feeling of being consciously aware without needing a separate, more mysterious concept of sentience.
Interesting.
However, he also notes that enosis, as he defines it involving mesocortex, might be specific to mammals. This leaves open the possibility of a more fundamental, perhaps first-order type of awareness, maybe closer to traditional sentience existing in both humans and other mammals, but perhaps being overshadowed or integrated into enosis in us.
Okay, wow. We've journeyed through the four realms. Now we arrive at the final section of the book, the stories we tell ourselves and others. This is where LeDoux discusses how our unique human conscious experiences might actually arise, drawing on his earlier work with split-brain patients, right?
Yes. This last part really attempts to bring everything together into a cohesive picture of human consciousness. LeDoux revisits the idea, developed initially with Michael Gazzaniga back in the 70s.
The interpreter theory.
The interpreter hypothesis, exactly. The core idea is that humans constantly construct interpretations and narratives to make sense of who we are and why we do what we do. This helps us maintain a sense of mental coherence even though we have multiple non-conscious brain systems operating simultaneously, sometimes even pulling us in different directions.
So we're storytellers about ourselves.
Fundamentally, this interpreter idea has evolved over the years into his current view, that our inner narrations translate the content of our non-conscious working memory mental models into our conscious experiences.
And these narratives aren't necessarily in words or images that we'd recognize, but maybe in a more abstract, modality-independent mentalese.
That's the proposal, a kind of language of thought that provides the conceptual content of our consciousness and also guides our speech and intentional actions. It's quite similar, actually, to Jerome Bruner's ideas about the narrative construction of our understanding of reality.
And the confabulations observed in split-brain patients, where they invent plausible explanations for actions initiated by the non-speaking hemisphere.
Like the patient choosing a shovel with the left hand because the right hemisphere saw snow, but verbally saying they chose it to clean out the chicken coop because the left hemisphere saw a chicken claw.
Right. Those offer a striking example of this drive to create coherent stories, even when they're wrong. LeDoux suggests that this narrative process is fundamental to all of us. Confabulations are perhaps just more extreme versions that compensate for neurological issues, while our everyday narratives are more routine, explanatory processes that help us make sense of things. We're constantly weaving these inner stories, and this ties into our understanding of our own folk psychology, our intuitive theories about how minds work, and our theory of mind, our ability to understand the mental states of others.
Bruner's argued that our folk psychology helps us make sense of ordinary events and that new narratives are often constructed when our existing beliefs or expectations are challenged or violated. Burns also highlights the important role of our episodic memories, our personal past, in shaping these ongoing personal narratives.
It's also interesting to consider LeDoux's point that our conscious awareness of what we say or write is actually separate from the non-conscious processes that generate those words in the first place.
Right. Our verbal expressions and our conscious experience can be seen as parallel outputs of an underlying non-conscious mental model and its associated narrative content. Thinking isn't necessarily talking to yourself silently first.
So our thoughts and our words are like two streams flowing from the same, deeper, often unconscious source. And LeDoux makes a useful distinction here between non-conscious states and preconscious states.
Yes, preconscious states are the non-conscious mental activities that are the immediate precursors to conscious awareness. They're the stuff that could become conscious. There might even be different generators for our verbal and visual narratives, perhaps related back to Baddeley's articulatory loop and visuospatial sketchpad in working memory.
So different systems generating different types of narrative content.
Potentially. In theory, every sensory system could contribute to its own type of narrative. However, for us to have a unified, multimodal conscious experience, seeing and hearing and feeling things as one integrated whole, these different components need to be bound together somehow.
And this leads to the idea of a preconscious narrative in this abstract mentalese format, which then has three main output pathways, or distributaries, as he calls them.
Right. One pathway leads to our verbal expression, what we say, another to our actions and goal-directed behavior, what we do, and a third pathway leads to the population of a second conscious mental model within our prefrontal cortex working memory, what we experience.
Wow, okay, so the preconscious model feeds speech, action, and the conscious model.
That's the idea. The emotal nature of this underlying mentalese narrative allows its conceptual content to be used flexibly by these diverse downstream processing systems. The conscious mental model then essentially receives an updated version of its own content from this preconscious model. This leads to a quite layered view of consciousness. Michel apparently suggested calling it the HO theory.
HO.
Higher order, suggesting lower order neurobiological states, a first higher order state, the preconscious cognitive model, and then a second higher order state, the conscious model.
Layers upon layers. And because these pathways, speech, action, consciousness, are somewhat separate, there can sometimes be a mismatch between what we say and what we do, and also why our verbal reports might not always perfectly reflect our underlying conscious experience.
Exactly. It allows for that potential discordance. Constructing these conscious mental states also seems to require significantly more neural resources and energy compared to non-conscious cognitive processing. It's metabolically expensive to be conscious in this rich way.
Makes sense.
Different kinds of conscious states also seem to have different energy demands. Basic anoesis, that background feeling, might be relatively low energy. Noetic consciousness, dealing with explicit facts and concepts, requires more. And the self-referential, time-traveling autonoetic consciousness is likely the most energy-intensive.
And LeDoux emphasizes that this idea of dual mental models, pre-conscious and conscious, isn't the same as the more popular System 1, System 2 view of cognition, like Kahneman's.
Right. He actually proposes a reorganization based on his realms. System 1 corresponds to the neurobiological realm, model-free, automatic processes. System 2 corresponds to the cognitive realm, model-based but preconscious mental models. And System 3 corresponds to the conscious realm, the conscious model-based mental model.
Okay, a three-system view tied to the realms.
The complexity arises, and this is a real challenge for research, from the fact that both the preconscious System 2 and conscious System 3 mental models can apparently independently influence our behavior and verbal expressions. This makes it incredibly tricky to determine which model is truly driving the bus at any given moment just by observing behavior or asking for reports.
How do you know if an action came from the conscious plan or the preconscious one?
Exactly. However, understanding this complication, this potential separation, could actually be key to developing more accurate theories and experiments about consciousness. It's even possible, LeDoux speculates, that our strong feeling of consciously initiating an action might sometimes be an illusion generated retrospectively by the preconscious model, while genuine conscious agency, if it exists, might come from influencing things via the conscious model itself.
That's a mind bender. Our sense of control might be partly constructed after the fact.
It's a possibility raised by this kind of framework. And there's the suggestion from Ongchoko of using sophisticated tools like neural network metrics to try and identify the distinct neural signatures of these preconscious and conscious mental models in brain activity.
Using AI tools to understand the brain's layers. And finally, LeDoux also touches on the limitations of strong AI arguments, saying that simply passing the Turing test, acting intelligently, shouldn't automatically equate to having subjective consciousness.
Right. He aligns more with John Searle's biological naturalism, the view that consciousness, as we know it, requires the specific neurobiological mechanisms of a biological brain, and also mentions Tim Bain's similar natural kind approach, which treats consciousness as a specific kind of physical process, like digestion or respiration, that needs particular biological machinery.
So consciousness is biological, physical.
Ultimately, LeDoux argues strongly that consciousness is a legitimate and crucial topic for the natural sciences. It's just as real and physical as our biology and our cognitive abilities, even if it's incredibly complex and difficult to study.
Well, that was a truly in-depth exploration of Joseph LeDoux's The Four Realms of Existence, a real deep dive. We've journeyed from the fundamental biological level through the emergence of neurobiology and the development of cognition, and finally into the complex and fascinating world of consciousness and its potential origins in our inner narratives.
It's quite a framework he builds.
It really is. The idea that our self might be more of an ongoing construction, a narrative, and our conscious experiences shaped so heavily by non-conscious processes, that certainly offers a powerful new lens through which to view ourselves, doesn't it?
What becomes clear, as you've heard throughout this, is the intricate interplay between these different realms. Each builds upon the last, and they all interact constantly. LeDoux's framework provides a compelling way to think about what it means to be human in a more integrated and dynamic sense, moving beyond maybe simplistic either explanations.
For you, our listener, who values gaining knowledge efficiently yet thoroughly and enjoys those aha moments without feeling totally overwhelmed, we truly hope this deep dive has provided some valuable insights. Understanding these interconnected realms can, perhaps, offer a richer appreciation for the incredible complexity of your own being and the world around you.
And maybe this leads to a really thought-provoking question for you to consider. Given LeDoux's suggestion that our sense of consciously controlling our actions might sometimes be an illusion, or at least a narrative constructed slightly after the fact by a pre-conscious mental model, what implications does that have for how we understand concepts like responsibility and free will? It definitely challenges us to think about the extent to which we are truly the sole authors of our choices, and if perhaps our intuitive sense of agency isn't always the full story. It's certainly a question that's worth mulling over as you continue to navigate your own four realms of existence.